Alright, well today we're going to finish up the last little part of the French Revolution, the last little part of the Napoleonic Wars. It is a disastrous invasion of Russia. Battle of Leipzig, Elba, the 100 Days, Waterloo, St. Helena, Treaty of Vienna, which ends the whole thing, 1815. Then look at some of the highlights of the Industrial Revolution, particularly what it's dealing with in England. James Watt, Eli Whitney, between mercantilism and capitalism. British Parliamentary Acts, the Factory Act, the Coal Mines Act, the 10 Hours Act, and like the Irish potato famine. Any questions on those?
Bring it.
Alright, good. 1810, so Napoleon was effectively mastered the entire continent. What territory he had not annexed directly to France was essentially a satellite state of France. The Holy Roman Empire, which had stood for 1,000 years, was abolished in 1806. He wasn't going to have any emperors. He was himself an emperor. Instead, he reorganized it as the Holy Roman Empire as the Confederation of the Rhine. Prussia, Austria, Russia, Denmark are forced into an alliance with France, basically. They're independent, but they have to do what France says. We're talking about the continental system, attempt to try to starve Britain into submission. But in 1810, Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, decides he's going to withdraw from the continental system. But he's not having Napoleon push him around anymore. He can stand up to it. Well, Russia withdrawing from the continental system sparked a French economic slump. In order to try to recover its popularity at home, the French economy, and prevent other nations from leaving the continental system, France decides, particularly Napoleon decides, he needs to make an example out of Russia. So, he makes the decision he's going to invade Russia. Take over the whole thing. Now, Russia is the largest country on Earth. It was by this time. It spans 12 time zones. It's thousands of miles long, but thinly populated, though, in comparison to its size. The heart of Russia has always been Moscow, the capital. Like I said, it's the center of transportation, of government, of the economy, of finance, culture, basically, is everything Russia is. If you take over Moscow, basically you've taken over Russia. And so that is basically going to be Napoleon's plans. He's going to storm through Russia, barrel through the Russian defenses, which had never been much of a problem for him before, leaving from Poland, which he'd made essentially, he'd stripped away from Russia and made into a satellite state of France called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. And so Napoleon launches his invasion in June of 1812. It's about the same time that the United States declared war on Britain over its policies towards American shipping and American neutrality. It's going to distract Britain. Britain's going to be distracted from both the wars in France and the United States because of having to fight two wars at once. But you see here the map, page 602. Napoleon storming into Russia. He has his what's called the Grand Army, 600,000 troops, an immense army. And of course, Napoleon is an unquestioned military genius, and subduing Russia, that shouldn't be much of a problem. Just looking at the numbers. And so Alexander had looked at the numbers as well. He couldn't beat Napoleon in a head-to-head confrontation. So what he's going to do, Alexander is going to do is, it's the most basic rules of warfare, which is don't fight on your enemy's terms, fight on your terms. The two great advantages Russia has always had is time and distance. Huge country. In fact, it's shaped like a funnel. The further in you go, the wider the country gets. You're basically about most of Siberia, then it starts getting smaller again on the other side, towards North America. And, of course, time. Russia is a very cold country in the wintertime. Actually, several military analysts have often said that Russia's greatest advantage is what they call general winter. So Napoleon's starting off here in June, middle of summer. Conditions reasonable. But Alexander has realized his troops cannot beat Napoleon head-on, especially not an army of 600,000. So he decides to unveil what can be called a scorched earth strategy. Essentially, he's going to try to pull the French in, deeper and deeper into Russia. Because their target is Moscow, so they're going to destroy the Russian army is going to destroy anything of value between itself and the French army. So the French cannot live off the land. They'll have no resources drawn, no extra supplies of food or anything else. And so they'll have to depend on supply lines coming all the way from Poland. And so these supply lines are getting longer and longer, becoming more and more difficult to keep up with the French army. And so what they're going to do is, as they pull the French army deeper into Russia, these extended supply lines, they're not going to hit the army directly. They're going to do is they're going to try to hit the supply lines behind the French army, try to disrupt their ability to resupply themselves. Remember, as Napoleon himself had famously said, an army marches on its stomach. This means an army to be able to fight well, after having marched the many hundreds of miles from one battle to the next, it needs to be properly fed. So the men can keep up their strength, resist disease, proper nutrition, so they can have so they can be in fit fighting form when the time to fight really does start. Well, the scorched earth strategy leaves Napoleon basically unable to hold any kind of Russian territory. And so they're being pulled deeper and deeper into Russia, Napoleon pushing forward. The Russians steadily retreating until finally the Russians turn to fight. It's the Battle of Borodino. So late 1812. Russians turn around and hit the French with everything they've got. But it's not enough. The Russians still lose. They suffer very heavy casualties in this battle, but Napoleon's suffered very heavy casualties as well. But Napoleon presses on. He finally enters Moscow. He's captured Moscow, the heart of Russia. So he should have accomplished everything he wanted at this point. But the Russians had another surprise for him. The city is completely deserted. They couldn't find anybody. The royal family, the government, the civilians, if anything of value, was gone.
So they were tipped off?
Yeah, they were tipped off. They knew the Russians were coming. The French were coming for months. So they had time to prepare. So now, winter has come, and of course the French army is going to have to stay in Moscow through the winter. Like I say, you go to take over a country, you have to occupy it. Basic real warfare. Well, course, their supply lines coming all the way from Poland. Basically, everything of value in and around Moscow has been destroyed. The city itself, though, completely deserted. But then they realize the city has not been entirely deserted. Alexander did evacuate quite everybody. You see, the Tsar did leave a few people behind. He emptied the prisons and the mental asylums and turned them out into the streets. Thieves, murderers, arsonists.
This is the Russian.
Yeah, the Russian Tsar, Alexander.
Seems like they get a lot of crazy people, like Stalin and all them. It seems like
Yeah,
one after another.
It's the cold.
Yeah, think about that. And so Alexander, though, was a fairly stable figure compared to Ivan the Terrible or Joseph Stalin or others. But
You said Ivan the Terrible?
Yes.
compared to Ivan the Terrible, yeah, Ivan the Terrible was psychotic. 300 years before.
Sound like he's
He was. But Tsar Alexander, though, he's a desperate man. He's trying to save his country. The only thing he can do is basically wreck it to save it. So this is what he's done is he can't couldn't defeat the French army head on, so he had to find some other way to fight them. So basically what he's done is the French army is in the middle of Moscow, in the middle of Russia, in the middle of winter. Very hard, difficult, bitterly cold winter. Supply lines are disrupted by the Cossacks, basically these Russian cavalry units, very fierce fighters. And now the French started to see just who was left behind in Moscow. Because Moscow's an old city, mostly wooden buildings, except for a few here and there. And so, little fires start here and there. They put it out. Then another one starts somewhere else. A couple more here and there. And before long, the whole city's on fire. Wooden city, the whole thing goes up very quickly. French army, if only the French army realized, like I said, they can't stay in the city because it's burning to the ground, so they have to leave Moscow. And realize that the only thing they can do is head back to Poland, about 1,000 miles across hostile territory.
Why are they starting fires?
Because of all the arsonists, all the criminals they released. That's who the Russians left behind in Moscow.
And they didn't know that the French were coming, did they? The ones that
Yeah, they knew the French were coming, and this is exactly what they planned on. Just keep the worst of their society to harass the...
But I'll tell you, the worst of the society didn't know.
Yeah.
They
Like I said,
didn't know.
they didn't exactly know, but Alexander was counting on them to do exactly what they do, which was cause trouble.
They were unwitting heroes.
Exactly. So now Napoleon, from humiliation, defeat, puts his army back on the long march back to Poland. Now the Russians decide to fight. And so they do this long column, miles long, going back across Russia in the dead of winter. The Russians are hitting the French army, hit-and-run tactics, going back and forth, just minimal casualty, but hitting the French as hard as they can, as fast as they can, and pulling back. It's disrupting them constantly, completely destroying their morale.
So as they're trying to go back, the Russians are doing.
Yeah,
In winter when they're not used to
exactly.
so much snow.
So the Russians are cold too, but they have homes and camps they go to that are warm. The French don't, because everything of value they could use has been destroyed. Like I said, the French they have very little food. In fact, some of their horses are frozen over, so they end up having to eat some of the horses they've brought with them.
Didn't they like pillage the village? You know, like go in and
They did, but there was nothing left in these villages. Remember, scorched earth strategy.
Yeah, scorched earth.
I guess that's one they did also.
Yeah. They're able to find a little bit, but not much, because it's all been destroyed. the Russian artillery come along. But they wouldn't necessarily fire on the French. They would not the French directly. They would aim their artillery at the frozen lakes and rivers the French army is crossing. So basically, on the solid ice they're walking across. You remember, living here in the deep south, here in Arkansas, this part of Arkansas, it snows maybe once every 3 or 4 years or something. Like say, you got frost in your windows, that's about it. We're talking about the hard, deep freezes of deep Russia, where basically you have ice several inches thick on the rivers and lakes.
You can ice skate on?
You can ice skate on, actually thick enough to hold people up. But kind of thickness of ice we don't ever see out here, but it's thick enough there to do it.
You wouldn't make it.
Unless, say, you fire a bunch of artillery on it. Ice crumbled, Russian and French soldiers sink to the bottom, drown.
Freeze. Right.
The rough time.
Whoever did it, drowned.
That's smart, though.
So facing all these conditions, Napoleon's army crumbles. You have some desperate, just except tired of the war, tired of the fighting. They go off, they desert the army, just trying to find food on their own. The troops are dying of malnutrition, of exposure, hypothermia, in addition to battlefield deaths. Like I said, this is all in January of 1813. So by the time his Grand Army reaches Poland, relative safety, his Grand Army is 600,000 is down to 120,000. He's lost 80% of his army. And now, seeing that Napoleon's been defeated, humiliated, and his army's forces are down to minimal numbers, his one-time allies, his forced allies, of Prussia, Austria, and other nations start to turn on Napoleon. So in 1813, Napoleon is facing battles all over Eastern and Central Europe as Prussia, Austria, and others start putting their armies back together and fighting Napoleon head-on. By October of 1813, there's the Battle of Leipzig. This is in central Germany. And the Allies managed to inflict a fatal defeat on Napoleon. Fatal for his army, at least. So the Allies, are now on the offensive against Napoleon. And with Leipzig, they force him to leave Germany and re-enter France. He's retreated across the Rhine, which is the traditional border of France. And now, going into 1814, Napoleon is just waiting for the inevitable. By March 1814, the Allied forces reached Paris. The Prussians, the Austrians, the English swarming into France. On April 6th, April 1814, Napoleon abdicates, basically resigns as emperor. And he goes into exile. The small island of Elba. Now, Elba, as you see here on page 602, it's this tiny little island between Corsica and Italy. Napoleon is allowed to go there basically to rule this tiny little island, but he cannot leave. The Allies have considered a lot of things to do with Napoleon, but they're trying to remember what happened with the French Revolution. They don't want to set the precedent that it's okay to execute a monarch or someone ruling a country. Because, again, they're worried about their own situation at home. So basically they say, okay, we're not going to kill Napoleon, we're not going to execute him for his war crimes or worth aggression, but we're going to force him to exile. Basically, Elba, where he just sit there and basically stay out of the way and not cause trouble for anybody. Well, in the meantime, though, Napoleon's infant son is briefly brought to the throne as Napoleon II. Like I say, just a couple of years old at this point. Like I said, not even quite 3 yet. But because Napoleon's father had resigned, he was next in line legally. So the French Senate basically kept Napoleon II on the throne basically as a figurehead while they negotiated the surrender of the Allied forces. Basically, they need somebody in charge, basically, while everything was settled. What ends up happening is Napoleon II then is taken off the throne. He's sent to exile himself in Prussia, as he lives the rest of his life on this little estate in Prussia, where he's kept under guard the rest of his life.
When was he sent?
Shortly after the surrender, 1814. He's not sent to be with his father. Yeah, he's a little kid.
Was he treated well, or is it like a...
Well, he was as well as he could be, for just consider with respect for his position. I say he lives in his palace his whole life, but he is under guard. Can't leave.
Why was he sent to his father?
I don't know.
Bad and
Maybe so. Maybe bad influence. Maybe afraid he might get some ideas of coming back to power himself one day. Who knows? But basically, Napoleon II lived the rest of his life in this palace under guard. He died at the age of 21, 1832. He got sick and died. They didn't have a lot of medications back then, so basically, get sick, you go fast. So what ends up happening is the Allies decide they're going to put a king back on the throne of France. They're going to make it a constitutional monarchy. So basically, the French Revolution ends where it started again, with a constitutional monarch, an absolute monarch, but a constitutional. And so they choose the next one next one in line for the French throne, for the old House of Bourbon. Louis XVI's brother had managed to escape, and he takes the throne as Louis XVIII. Ruled to his death in 1824. Of course, here's the question: Louis XVI, Louis XVIII. What happened to 17?
He probably died.
Yeah, he died.
Yeah.
Who would have been Louis XVII was Louis XVI's son. He was 10 years old when his father and mother were executed. He's kept in prison the rest of his life, routinely beaten and abused. But the monarchists, who are still basically, in 1793, are still fighting for the monarchy, fighting to restore the royal family. They were looking to him as the new king, because legally his father was dead. His son, now Louis XVII, would have been the king. So they're considering him to be Louis XVII. But because he was the symbol they were rallying around, the French the Jacobins kept him in prison, and he ended up dying in prison. So completely alone, except for his prison guards. So how he finally died, we're really not sure. All sorts of rumors. Some say he's poisoned. Some say he got sick and died. And others say murdered in some way, but we have no way of knowing. Because towards the end of his life, he is guarded very closely, and no one is saying anything about his condition until he actually died. But interestingly enough, after the war, there were several people popping up around Europe claiming to be Louis XVII, but they were all imposters. So, Louis XVI, his wife, his children are dead, so they go to his brother, Louis XVIII. had spent the French Revolution in exile in England. Well, after a few months of exile in Elba, Napoleon's getting tired of it, decides he's going back to France whether the Allies like it or not. So he gets on a boat, he leaves Elba, and goes to the port of Marseille, see here in southern France. Basically, he arrives on the shore, and he's ready to reclaim his position as emperor. And the people see him there, of course. They love him, he's a beloved figure, they start flocking to him, and they start marching to Paris. Like I said, he goes along, more people see he's escaped exile, he's coming back to France, and they start joining him. Well, Louis XIV hears that Napoleon has returned, so he sends the army down to southern France to take him into custody and return him to exile, but the French army arrives. These were many troops that had been trained by Napoleon, had fought with Napoleon, had seen glory on the battlefield with Napoleon. So they immediately switched sides from Napoleon. So the Bonapartists are getting closer and closer to Paris. Louis XVIII's attempts to try to have him apprehended fail repeatedly. And fearing the fate of his brother, decides he's leaving Paris as quickly as he can. Goes back to England and warns the Allies. Napoleon is in France. He's retaken power in the country. So this whole period is what came to be called the 100 Days. 100 days from when he arrives in France till his final overthrow.
So before Napoleon got to Paris, Louis the 18th had already left, is that?
Yeah. Like I said, he learned, he figured it out fast, his brother didn't. Well, Napoleon realizes the Allies just simply aren't going to sit there and let him be Emperor of France again. Not of all the trouble he caused. So he pulls together his own army and decides he's going to attack the Allied army before they have a chance to attack him. And so he invades the Netherlands in order to defeat the reassembling Allied armies. Battle site is Waterloo. Now Napoleon is trying to find the Allied armies. They're kind of hard to find, locate. They're separated by miles and miles. But he sends one unit off to try to find the army. But he ends up meeting the army under the Duke of Wellington. It's an English nobleman, a very good tactical mind. And so he and Wellington end up fighting here in July of 1815, fighting back and forth. Wellington's actually outnumbered, but manages to do something hardly any general had ever done. He defeats Napoleon, making him a great hero in England and across Europe. Napoleon surrenders. And since then, Waterloo has come synonymous with meaning basically your final defeat, or your really big mistake. Well, this time, Napoleon is taken back into exile. A second time. He's not going to Elba, a nice Mediterranean resort. No, they're sending him far, far out of the way of Europe, someplace they really can't, people really aren't going to bother him, and he's not going to bother anybody else, and he can be under guard the rest of his life. It's the tiny little island of St. Helena. It's a British island in the South Atlantic. Like I say, separated by, as the nearest other island, point of land is hundreds of miles away. And so he and his wife are heading down to St. Helena. And a few favorites from court are going with them, basically loyal to the end, thinking that life on St. Helena is going to be an endless party, just a great time, because they'll be there with Napoleon. But they arrive on this British ship. They're approaching St. Helena and see this big, ugly brown rock rising out of the water. It's not a pretty island. It was designed basically, it was chosen specifically because it would be able to keep Napoleon far out of the way. In fact, one of these upper class women is so excited about being in exile with Napoleon tries to jump overboard when she sees St. Helena. So it's too late to change your mind.
It's too late.
So Napoleon is living here in St. Helena the rest of his life, under guard. He writes his memoirs. In his memoirs, he makes a rather curious point about the powers of Europe. He said they wanted another Washington. Another Washington. What he was referring to was George Washington, the first president of the United States. Washington had defeated the British during the American Revolution, and as a victor, traditionally in Europe, Washington could have had anything he wanted. He could have named himself dictator for life or king of the United States. But instead, in fact, Washington even as an elected president, he could have been president the rest of his life if he wanted to, so popular. But Washington willingly gave up power. He stepped aside and turned it over to someone else. They believe that the country is more than just George Washington. Other men were capable of doing the job, and other men should have the chance to do the job. The people should be able to decide. He willingly gave up power. Something hardly ever before done in any kind of revolution. And Napoleon just spent the rest of his life muttering that they wanted him to give up power too, willingly. Napoleon died in 1821 in exile in St. Helena. They believe it was stomach cancer, but there were some reports that maybe he was poisoned, especially by people desperate to get away from St. Helena once and for all. But he died. His body was brought back to France. So there's a tomb to him in Paris.
What year did he say that?
Died in 1821.
This is very long after his exile.
Yeah, he's just in exile for 6 years at St. Helena. Only 52 when he died. Fairly young.
That's the first one I've heard in his species.
Yeah.
More.
A lot of boredom too, but yeah, just kind of say sometimes stress can cause a health decline, make you more susceptible to cancers. They think there is a connection somehow there.
Is it true that he was like really short?
Yeah, he's only like about 5'4".
I heard there was a measuring mistake.
Like I say, but this is an age when people are generally shorter
Yeah, I
than
mean, that's
now.
not
The average for men now is like
unbelievably
5'9".
short, yeah.
He's shorter than usual, but there's a stereotype for the French. They do tend to be a little shorter than, say, the average Dutchman or the average Swede or something.
Yeah.
Like I said, a little shorter than average, though.
I wonder what average was back then, about 5'7" for a man or something?
5'6", 5'7". Yeah, somebody like George Washington was like 6'3", 6'4". He's sort of kind of a giant.
George Washington was 6'3"?
Yeah, he's a big guy.
Huh.
In fact, heights are generally so much shorter than they are now that they have some of these old buildings, some parts of France, where the ceilings are actually too low for some people now.
I bet here in another, say, 30 years, everybody's going to be like average. Short person's going to be like 6 foot.
I'd say because nutrition and healthcare has improved so much, people generally have gotten taller because they're able to.
I hear people breathe.
Yeah.
And they start breathing.
I'd say average height probably won't go too quickly, but I'd say probably in a few hundred years it could easily be 6 foot. If,
Average?
yeah, if in a few hundred years, if these trends hold up.
Yeah.
I'd say if life expectancy holds up, people who would be over 100 would be average.
So average now is what, about 5'9", 5'10"?
Yeah, 5'9" now. I'm about average height. The life expectancy, the Western world believes about 80.
Right here?
Yeah. But this time period, early 1800s, life expectancies maybe about 50, 60.
So if,
Yeah, a lot of
if
them
it's
died in
80
the 50s.
now, if it's 80 now, like say my age now, say 30 years from now, it'll probably go up to about 85 or.
It could very easily go up to 85.
Yeah.
Like I say,
And that's average.
yeah. And of course, say if you live to be, say, 65, your chances of living to be 80 or 85 are much more increased. Well, obviously, if you die at 64, you're much older, but
Yeah.
basically, the closer you get to it, the better your odds are.
Yeah.
But,
But is that just the United States or is that worldwide? Because I've heard that we have a lower life expectancy.
like I say, it depends on who you are and where you're at. So, say, if you have people living in very undeveloped countries that have no health care, they have very poor, let's see this map here, this World Hunger map of the United Nations, those dark red countries in Central Africa and areas like that. Very low life expectancy because very high infant mortality rate, poor health care, poor nutrition. You're just not going to live very long there. Like I said, high HIV rate, portions of Southern Africa, basically, they got life expectancy there dropped to like the 40s. Like I said, does that mean there aren't people who live to be their 70s or 80s? There are people, but not very many. In the United States, we have a problem because, well, basically it's becoming more and more divided along class lines. If you're middle class or upper class, you have a good chance of living a long time because you have access to good nutrition and health care. But if you're not very wealthy, like I say, you're not going to live as long because, like I say, it's very expensive now to eat healthy, eat right, or get medical care. You have a lot of people who are just they have the attitude, well, those doctors don't know anything. Like I said, it's not feeling well, I'll just walk it off and be fine, but they could be having a serious heart problem, which could be treated. They ignore symptoms of a cancer that could be treated at early stages. And so I've had a problem in a lot of areas of more rural parts of America. You have problems of prescription drug abuse, meth, other drugs. That's lowering life expectancies as well.
I bet in at least about 20 years from now, they'll have a lot more cures.
Oh, yeah, they will. Like I say, they can cure and treat conditions today that were death sentences 20 years ago.
Yeah.
They'll be able to do the same in another 20 years.
Cool.
Like I said, but a man like Napoleon dying in his 50s, that was not entirely unusual in those days. I go to the cemetery here in town, look at some of those men died like in the 1920s, 1930s. See a lot of them they died in their 50s. You say 50 years old, you're considered an old man, but you're still the prime of your life.
Yeah.
I didn't say that.
No, I just said yeah. I just said heck yeah.
Treaty Vienna. While Napoleon is enjoying his night's vacation at St. Helena, the Allies finishing up the terms of the Napoleonic Wars, and that is the Treaty of Vienna. Basically redraws the map of Europe, sets conditions for France, basically orders it to be a constitutional monarchy, and that is that.
Very good.
Of course, you have the sad situations with Napoleon II and Louis XVII, though. It's the real tragedy of these kind of things is the children of these leaders are so often, because of the symbols they become, are often the first targets. So they're completely innocent. It's because of who they are, what they represent, not because of anything they've done. They often have very unpleasant lives, very short lives. Let's go to the Industrial Revolution. Now, all the science and ideas, technology being developed and the Enlightenment is starting to have a practical effect here through the Industrial Revolution. Now, in Britain, there had been something in the agricultural revolution in the 1700s. More food coming available because of better farming techniques. Colonies in the Americas are providing more food. So if they have more food, prices are going lower. Less labor needed on food. So, increase in population. Food's cheaper, more abundant, people can eat better. So live longer. And now since food is cheaper, you have excess income, start purchasing other goods. At least some people do. and the excess labor to produce more because not as many people are needed on the farms. So they have increased trade throughout the British Empire. France is experiencing a similar thing, but they also have what they call cottage industries. Basically, skilled laborers working at tables, building various products, usually all by hand. Like say, like gunsmiths, for example, might have a big room where you have about 20 or 30 tables and people just all manufacturing guns one at a time. And so it wasn't necessarily set hours. You had a set quota you needed to produce for the week. And you have these cottage industries for everything. Jewelry, cobblers, silversmiths, blacksmiths, and so forth. Just people making these various different products. And of course, the money made from this trade, this cottage industry, is providing extra money that people can invest in other things, such as mechanizing these cottage industries, finding ways to manufacture these automatically. Just a little bit of machinery. Now, Britain had two things going for it as the Industrial Revolution starts. It has an excellent banking system and an excellent navy. Banking system provides financing for expanded businesses of all different types. Its navy can protect its different colonies, protect the raw materials its factories need. It can also protect the shipping lanes from other navies and from piracy. So what you end up having, though, is this transitional period between mercantilism and capitalism. There's a slight difference between the two. Now, in both systems, you do have the profit motive. In both systems, you want to make money.
Yeah.
It's unlike socialism, it's an economic system where you have a social outcome to promote. Now, this between capitalism and mercantilism, though, is how do you make and how do you keep money? Different theories on that, how that happens. Now, mercantilism, you start seeing this especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. Capitalism starts taking hold in the 19th century. Now, one of the differences, though, is scale. Mercantilism has this local scale, mom and pop stores, and so forth. Capitalism, looking at a global scale. Big multinational corporations with thousands and thousands of people trading across national boundaries, where mercantilism is more regionally based. Now, the theory on money is very different. Mercantilism, they believe the amount of money in the world is fixed. Particularly by the amount of gold and silver in the world. So therefore, you can only, in mercantilism, you can only make money at the expense of someone else, because the amount of wealth in the world is fixed. For example, you have this pie chart here. Suppose this represents all the money in the world. You have Britain its share of gold in the world, France with its, Spain, Russia, and so forth. And they can only gain money by taking money from someone else. So Britain making money off France, France making money off Spain, and so forth. You see, suppose I have $1 and I have one book, and I'm trying to decide to buy your book. It's about what you get at book buyback.
Right.
I see that, yeah.
Yes,
But
the
the way the mercantilist will say it is, okay, you have one book and $1 for the transaction. After the transaction, you still have one book and $1. It's just switched hands.
Okay.
The capitalist will look at that and look 3 or 4 transactions down the line. What are you going to do because you have that dollar? Buy more books and sell them. Or what am I going to do with this book? Or whatever else. I use it for some other project I'm working on which makes more money in second, third, fourth transaction. See, capitalism, they say the amount of wealth in the world is potentially unlimited. It just depends on how you define it.
So capitalism relies on inflation.
Not necessarily. But it's the idea, though, that there's no limit to wealth in the world.
Abstract idea of wealth.
Exactly. Because remember, why is that dollar bill in your pocket worth anything?
Because we give it back.
Exactly. We give it value. We decided it's worth something. Why are gold and silver worth anything? Same reason. Because we decided it's worth something. Okay, this pretty rock is going to be worth something. We decided that. That's the deep, dark, dirty secret of money is it's just paper. It has value and we decided it does. Now, because the mercantile says because the amount of wealth in the world is fixed, balance of trade is of the utmost importance because you don't want to lose money overseas. And you'll do whatever you can to keep money in your country. But the capitalists say balance of trade, debatable. Depends on who you talk to and when. Actually, the U.S. has a trade deficit of about $300 billion. We buy $300 billion more products every year than we sell abroad, more or less. Mercantilists, we're having a stroke over that. Capitalists, some are concerned about that, some not. They're saying, look at the overall wealth of the United States. Like I said, we may be buying products from overseas, but it has not affected our wealth as a whole.
So
Because we're producing wealth, we're just shifting it around.
So ideally, you always want to export more than you import, import more than you export, right?
Yeah, export more than import. But mercantilists especially because they see you buying products overseas. They see all that money in your country going to someone else. But capital says, not necessarily a bad thing. It's what do you sell? Look at 3 or 4 transactions down the line. What are you getting from them? And what are you buying? What are they buying? It all evens out. So, in mercantilism, you do whatever you can to protect your trade interests. Try to make trade as difficult as possible on the other guy. Monopolies on certain products, which are encouraged by governments, high tariffs and tax values. Capitalist, they'll say monopolies. Except some say it's good, some say it's bad, but they say it's an inevitable result of market forces. That's it. But it's not dependent on whether or not countries may be making money or not. So that's basically the difference. How you think you're making money, how you think you're keeping money, that's driving how these countries are developing their economies, what they're investing in. Now, because Britain is trying to do whatever it can to keep money within its system, it's developing its own internal trade system. It's developing its infrastructure, developing trade between its colonies, developing its own banking system. But as a result of that, it's becoming more of a global trade power. Not just mom and pop store in England, huge companies doing business all over the world. So, Britain has 3 other things going for it. A lot of iron, a lot of coal, a lot of water power. Now, 1780, Britain had the highest standard of living in Europe. Had a system of roads, rivers, canals, and an intricate network able to get products and people from point A to point B. Between 1660 and 1760, British exports quadrupled. And so, industry starts moving into textiles. More people, more money, so we'll start buying things. When a country industrializes first, they always go to textiles, which is cloth. Finished cloth, finished clothing, basically something they don't have to do themselves. They don't have to make their own clothing anymore. Textiles, basically, it's already pre-made. You've got the money to buy it now. But of course, to manufacture this cloth, You have all sorts of different inventions coming along, such as the spinning jenny and the power loom, basically speeding up the process of turning this from cotton and wool into cloth. Something you can use to make into clothing, to having to spin it yourself, or an already finished product. To make that process even faster, all these little machines doing it, this guy comes along, James Watt. In the 1760s, he develops the steam engine. Steam engine, basically, it's a steam pump. We have a picture of it here.
Here. Picture 16. You can just edit it. Oh,
Yeah, a picture of it there.
want to go back and
Kind of shows a little bit.
replicate it.
Like I said, Watt makes a lot of money off of this. In fact, the measurement watt is actually a unit of it's actually a unit of power. So the wattage in your light is not how bright it is, it's how much power it's putting out, how much work it's doing. But as you can see here, though, it starts out, you have your furnace here on the left, or the side of it, warming up the water, and the steam power is basically causing these little turbines to turn.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be connected to all sorts of things. So it can either be used to connect it to steam pressure, connect those turbines to gears to turn machinery, or like this little system here, thing twisting it around, this little fulcrum here and there, back and forth. It can basically act as a pump, create a vacuum effect. It can pump water out of mines. It can turn machinery. Actually, it can turn paddle wheel on a boat. This is a huge advance for machinery and engineering, the steam engine.
And what was the reason for making it?
Why do you want to make it? Just curious. Just want to see if you can do it. Like I said, steam engines of various types have been attempted before in ancient times, but he wants to see if he can really do something really big and make a lot of money off it in the process. He's able to do. And so with the steam engine, they will drive this machinery, it will pump water from mines. As you can see here on page 612, a lot of these coal fields you see here in Wales, in northern England, near Scotland, like I said, they're not stopping here at the coast. They're actually going deep underground, under the ocean as well, which means a lot of cracks in the ground, a lot of water seeps in. They have to keep the water pumped out so they can get to the coal. Coal, which in turn fires these furnaces, which produces the steam power they need. And of course, that coal can be used for furnaces, for smelting metals, making steel, and other products. And so because of this, Watt's steam engine, automated spinning and weaving, textile mills explodes across Britain. Start seeing 613 here, this 1851 factory. And so Britain starts importing steadily more cotton. 1760, 2.5 million pounds of cotton. 1787, 22 million pounds. 1840, 366 million pounds. Between 1815 and 1850, the output of coal quadruples in Britain. But of course, they'll produce cotton, get it into a usual product. Okay, this man comes along, Eli Whitney. Invents the cotton gin. Cotton gin, basically, process of removing seeds from cotton, making it a lot easier to harvest, process, and send away for shipping. And all of a sudden now cotton is a viable product for manufacturing cloth. So, 1790s when Watt invents the cotton gin, except cotton production increases dramatically because it's a very valuable product now, and starts being shipped to British factories in droves. Yeah.
When did Eli Whitney invent the cotton?
1791. But of course, two problems with that, though. One, it's being grown mostly in the American South. It's very labor-intensive product, so you have more southern planters importing more slaves so they can produce more cotton. And British factories are expanding rapidly, but of course, are the workers seeing any kind of a value, any kind of money from this expansion of the Industrial Revolution? Nope. In fact, labor problems, labor conditions are getting steadily worse. Got other issues here. Production of iron increased and steel. 1740, Britain produced 17,000 tons of steel. Iron. By 1840, producing 2 million tons a year. 1852, 3 million. Using that to make metal machinery, ironclad ships, more importantly, get to the 1850s, railroads. Railroad lines themselves and the actual engines. 1804, Richard Trevithick invented the first steam-powered train. Used in South Wales, could carry 10 tons of ore and 70 people along at an amazing speed of 5 miles an hour. Of course, how fast do you walk? About 5 miles an hour. It beats walking, but it's not very fast. 1830, George Stephenson unveils his advance in locomotive technology, calls it the rocket. And you're walking along at a magnificent speed of 16 miles an hour.
Oh my God.
That's bad.
Yeah. At that time it was. The rail line between Liverpool and Manchester, 32 miles, to be done in 2 hours. Again, beats walking. Heck of the city's a lot. By 20 years, you have engines going 50 miles an hour. By 1840, you have 2,000 miles of railroad line in Britain. By 1850, 6,000 miles. And the train ends up becoming a huge symbol of the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's happening really first in England, but it starts filtering over into France because, well, the French end up getting wind of this new technology, these new products Britain is producing, and they hire a bunch of British engineers and mechanics, even though it was illegal to do so in the 1820s, to come to France and teach them how to manufacture this machinery, how to manufacture these tools they need to produce this machinery. But even though British skilled laborers are prohibited from leaving Britain until 1842, by 1825 there are at least 2,000 British mechanics in the continent of Europe. It spreads to France and then to Germany. Look here on page 617, see the industrialization of Europe by 1850. Mostly in England, but also in the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, portions of France, large portions of Germany. But of course, conditions are very difficult. Work hours range from 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, half an hour for lunch and dinner. No vacation, no weekend, no retirement. Yeah. Basically, paid very little. Workplaces are very regimented because it's all automatic now. They don't want you to come in and go as you please. They want you to make sure that you come and go at particular times. For example, here at 614, see this rules from the factory here in Germany, Berlin, in 1844. Actually, you arrive at 6 a.m. for work precisely, leave at 7 p.m., 13-hour day. A couple breaks in between, but not much. Actually, immediate dismissal for anyone found drunk in any of the workshops. If you talk back to your bosses, it's immediate dismissal. So on and so forth. Basically telling you cannot talk with anybody unless you need to talk to anybody. You talk to your supervisor. Everything has to be work-related.
That doesn't sound like a job.
Yeah, German efficiency. Of course, this is leading to unionization. course, more people demanding changes to how the workplace goes. So, for example, Britain in 1833 passes the Factory Act. This is basically aimed at child labor. Under the Factory Act, no children under 8 were allowed to work in any British factory or mine.
Under 8?
Under 8. That's considered a huge advance. Considered a huge advance in England. They set the age of consent at 12.
Wow.
But under the Factory Act, children between the ages of 9 and 13 could work only 8 hours a day. Children between 13 and 18, only 12 hours per day. That's considered a huge advance. But remember, in the United States,
Age of prestige, 21.
laws like this aren't enacted until 1938, a century later. Some parts of the world today, this still goes on. 1847, they come along with the 10 Hours Act. No children under 13 could work in factories. Women and boys aged 13 to 18 could work no more than 10 hours a day. In the 1850s, in the United States, they had what's called the 10 Hours Movement. The movement tried to limit the work hours to just 10 hours a day, but they never get any legislation passed.
No children under what age?
No children under 13 could work in mines or factories. And those children who were working were required to be given some kind of education by the company. The Coal Mines Act, 1842. No boys under 10 could work in these factories. No women at any age could work in these factories. That's considered to be too unsafe for them. And of course, these are kids. They have no education in most cases. They're routinely beaten. And they're living in slum conditions. The cities are growing very rapidly, but people are living in very poor conditions. 1848, the Public Health Act is passed in Britain, which creates the National Board of Health, which empowered to form local boards that establish modern sanitary systems. Because most of the slums in England, no running water, no sewage, very high disease rates.
Yeah.
In fact, the 1831 cholera epidemic was spread from contaminated water in the slums of London.
Yeah, they were showing something over the weekend in the History Channel about that. Well, actually how the Romans started, and years later that's when Europe picked it up. With the aqueducts and all that, with the septic systems and all that.
Yeah.
In Europe.
Yeah, they need sewage systems, they need clean water. Finally, they're starting to get that in the 1840s. The Irish potato famine, finally. Another example of what happens when foreign organisms are introduced into new environments. Potatoes, introduced to Ireland from the Americans, become a staple crop in Ireland because you can produce a lot more potatoes, a lot more cheaply than you can, say, wheat. So it becomes a staple source of food. But it gets infected by a fungus, which never could not cause any kind of problems before in Ireland, but that fungus had never encountered American white potatoes before. So, by 1845, the fungus has completely destroyed the potato crop, and people behind Ireland are starving. In a country of 8 million people, 1 million starved to death, 2 million more end up leaving Ireland altogether, going either to Britain first, usually Canada, the United States. Like I say, the famine finally ends in 1851, and Ireland, the population of Ireland still has not reached pre-famine levels.
So it was like potatoes were the main...
Yeah, they're the only kind of food they had. And Britain, even though they're controlling Ireland, did